I witnessed my two sons' demise in plain sight. Most agonizingly, I understood precisely who had orchestrated it. What remained a mystery, however, was that the individual behind their murder was a stranger to me, someone who had spent their entire existence anticipating my ruin. They nearly succeeded, but committed one critical error. They failed to comprehend my true identity. For more gripping tales of betrayal, like, subscribe, and share your location in the comments. My world imploded on a Tuesday afternoon. Though dramatic, no other description suffices. I was at my mundane office job, experiencing a perfectly unremarkable day. My phone vibrated persistently. Initially, I disregarded it. Calls at work are commonplace. Solicitors, spam, the usual. Yet an uncanny sensation lingered in the air, a palpable heaviness I couldn't quite articulate. I'd felt it before, during a period of my life I'm not proud of, in places I never discuss. That foreboding premonition that everything was about to unravel. I retrieved my phone to discover 7 missed calls from my wife, Fiona. 7. My stomach instantly clenched. The voicemail contained her harrowing screams, raw, broken, as if her entire being was capitulating. "Adrian, oh my God, Adrian, come to Riverside Hospital now. It's the boys. It's Marcus and Kyle. Oh God, please." The message abruptly ended. I have no recollection of departing the office or driving. My only memory is the hospital corridor, the stark, fluorescent ceiling, the sterile scent of bleach commingling with an odor I dreaded identifying. The walls felt excessively bright and frigid. Time seemed to crawl, save for my heart, which throbbed as if straining to breach my ribs. Fiona sat in the waiting area, beyond tears, her gaze fixated on nothing. Her hands trembled so violently she couldn't retain her coffee cup. It fell unnoticed. "Adrian." Her voice was a hollow echo. I grasped the truth even before she uttered another syllable, before the doctor emerged with that all-too-familiar grim expression. Doctors wear it when they're about to shatter a life. I knew. A father instinctively knows. Marcus was 17, Kyle 14. They had been shot in their school's parking lot, a total of 7 rounds discharged. Marcus perished in the ambulance. Kyle survived for 4 agonizing hours at the hospital before internal bleeding claimed him. The police attributed it to gang violence. Wrong place, wrong time. 2 innocent children caught in the crossfire of rival factions contending for territory. That's their narrative. That's what they believed. But I knew better, for I recognized the shooter's name. Hunter Vex, a minor enforcer for the East Side crew. I'd never personally met him, but identified him instantly upon hearing it. More crucially, I knew he hadn't acted alone. No one simply wakes up and decides to execute 2 teenagers in a school parking lot, unless they're paid to. The question wasn't who pulled the trigger, but who desired their demise. As I cradled my shattered wife, witnessing her primal, inhuman grief, a chilling realization pierced me. This wasn't random. This was profoundly personal. Someone had deliberately invaded my life, tearing away everything precious. Someone knew me, knew exactly how to inflict maximal pain. And they were about to discover they'd made the gravest error of their existence. The police detective who appeared at the hospital was named Marcus Chin. I found it cruelly ironic that his name matched my deceased son's. He exuded the weary air of someone who had served too long, witnessed too much agony, and ceased to be surprised. His eyes were fatigued, yet held a keen, professional, and detached glint. He sought answers. I wished to tell him his inquiries were futile, for I already understood. However, I remained silent. I had long ago learned that silence in the face of authority equated to survival. The details emerged gradually over the ensuing days. Marcus and Kyle had been in the parking lot post-school, awaiting a ride from Kyle's friend's older brother. They discussed video games, typical teenage pursuits. Then a car pulled up. Hunter Vex emerged. No words, just gunshots. He fired 7 times, reloaded, and fired again, ensuring both boys were down, then drove off with unsettling nonchalance. 3 witnesses, all terrified. 1 refused police cooperation. The other 2 provided descriptions impeccably matching Hunter Vex. He was apprehended 2 days later at a cousin's residence, casually drinking beer, seemingly carefree. But here's what gnawed at me. Hunter Vex wasn't the type to do this without cause. He was hired muscle, yes, but he had a code. On the streets, killing children requires substantial payment or intense blood feud. The East Side crew wasn't foolish enough to instigate a conflict with someone capable of retaliating effectively. Therefore, someone else ordered it. Someone with financial resources, someone with a motive. I began my own discreet investigation. Fiona was submerged in medication at home, barely speaking or eating. The funeral arrangements became my responsibility. I had to select caskets for my sons, choose flowers, and compose eulogies to be read over their bodies. It was the most brutal task I've ever undertaken, and I have endured brutality. Yet, amidst the funeral planning, the wake, and the empty condolences from those who couldn't possibly comprehend, I made calls, old calls, reaching out to figures from my past I'd hoped never to engage with again. I learned that Hunter Vex had procured a significant sum of cash approximately 3 weeks prior to the shooting. $20,000 with no apparent explanation. He suddenly possessed money, purchasing a new car, new clothes, and flaunting cash as if he'd won the lottery. Someone had paid him handsomely. I also unearthed another unsettling fact. Someone had been making inquiries about me. Serious, detailed questions, not idle neighborhood chatter. Where did I work? Did I have family, children? Which schools did they attend, and when were they typically there? Someone had been meticulously constructing a profile. Someone had been meticulously planning. That's when true fear enveloped me. Not the pervasive grief that already consumed my every waking moment, but a primal dread that signaled my family's insecurity, that whoever perpetrated this might not be finished. I hired security for Fiona, changed the locks, and began sleeping with a knife beneath my pillow, though I had sworn off that life, the life of perpetual alertness, paranoia, survival. On the 4th day following Kyle's funeral, Detective Chin returned. He sat opposite me at the kitchen table and uttered words that dramatically shifted my perspective. "Your sons were targeted, Mr. Adrian. This wasn't random. The shooter knew precisely where and when they would be there. Someone provided that intelligence." My hands went numb. "We're still investigating," Chin continued, "but I wanted you to know whoever did this was familiar with your family's routine. They knew your kid's schedule. This was personal." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Personal, yes, but how personal? And who would harbor such intense animosity towards my sons as to orchestrate their murders? The answer, I sensed, lay buried in my past. I vowed to unearth it, whatever the cost. I started with Fiona's phone, not out of a disregard for privacy, that ceased to matter the moment my sons were interred, but out of a desperate need for answers. And sometimes answers reside in the most inconspicuous places. She was asleep when I accessed it, heavily sedated by medication the doctor had prescribed. She barely slept otherwise, lying in bed, staring blankly. When exhaustion finally overwhelmed her, she'd collapse into a drug-induced unconsciousness for a few hours. I felt monstrous invading her privacy, but monsters achieve results. Her phone was locked, yet Fiona had always been predictable with passwords. I gained access on my 3rd attempt. Her recent calls predominantly showed familiar numbers: her sister, her mother, the funeral home, the hospital. But one number appeared repeatedly, tracing back months, a number I didn't recognize. And it wasn't just calls. There were numerous text messages, recently deleted. However, I knew how to recover them. The texts were initially cryptic, casual conversations devoid of overt signs of an affair or conspiracy. Yet the tone was intimate, familiar. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Don't tell Adrian anything. This will all be over soon, I promise. The dates extended back 6 months. 6 months of my wife secretly communicating with someone. My hands trembled as I dialed the number. I braced myself to hear another man's voice, for that particular anguish born of betrayal. But the voice that answered was cold, businesslike. Yes? Who is this? I maintained a level tone. A pause ensued, long enough to indicate a decision was being made. Hang up or remain on the line. This is private. You shouldn't have this number. The accent was faint, educated, not streetwise. This wasn't a random affair. This was someone with financial means, someone accustomed to authority. I hung up. For 2 hours, I sat in the darkness of my living room, trying to piece together the fragments. My wife had been in contact with someone for months, someone who insisted on secrecy, someone who instructed Fiona not to reveal anything to me, someone who said, "This will all be over soon." A horrifying logic began to coalesce. What if Fiona intended to leave me? What if this person had promised her something, money, a new life, an escape from our marriage? What if she'd been planning it all along, and Hunter Vex was part of that scheme? What if my wife played a role in our sons' deaths? No, I immediately suppressed that thought. I knew Fiona. She possessed certain weaknesses, yes, and was unhappy in our marriage. Although I recognized the depth of her despair, knowing she would never intentionally harm our children, her profound grief was undeniable. The raw anguish in her voice as she shrieked Marcus's name at the funeral was the sound of a mother's spirit shattering, an unfeigned cry. Yet I sensed a hidden truth within her. She concealed something, and I needed to uncover it. I patiently waited until daybreak. Fiona was stirring, though her presence was faint, as she sat at the kitchen table, an untouched cup of coffee before her. She was a mere shadow of her former self. The vibrant woman I had exchanged vows with 2 decades prior had vanished, replaced by a vacant figure consumed by sorrow and an additional unsettling emotion that mirrored guilt. "Who have you been conversing with?" I inquired softly. She froze, the coffee cup wobbling in her grasp. "What are you referring to?" she asked. The number, the phone calls, 6 months of conversations, text messages instructing you to reveal nothing to me. Who is it? Her complexion paled, not from shock, but with the pallor of someone caught in a long, dreaded moment. "Adrian, who?" My voice was devoid of anger, yet it was far more unsettling. It was arctic. She carefully placed the cup down with trembling hands. When her gaze met mine, her eyes held an emotion I had never witnessed before. Fear. It wasn't fear of me, but apprehension about the revelation she was about to impart. "His name is Oliver," she whispered. "Oliver Hartley. He's an entrepreneur. We met through my sister nearly a year ago. He was kind to me when you were distant, when you seemed to inhabit a different world, one I couldn't reach." "What does he desire?" I pressed, though the fragments of truth were already assembling themselves in my mind. "He offered me an escape," Fiona confessed, her voice cracking. "A divorce, ample funds to begin anew, a life where I wouldn't feel like I was living with a phantom. He promised he could facilitate it. He claimed to possess influential connections, legal assistance, everything. He merely required my cooperation with something." "Cooperation with what?" I asked. She remained silent, tears streaming down her face, unable to articulate the words. "Fiona, what did he request of you?" "He sought information about you," she finally managed. "He wanted to know your routine, your workplace, the boys' school, their usual attendance times. He explained it was a complex situation, a business conflict with someone linked to your past, and he needed details. He assured me it was innocuous, that no one would be harmed. He simply needed to understand your movements, your family's timetable, your vulnerabilities." The room began to spin around me. "You provided him with that information." "I didn't consider she began to say, but I was already on my feet, striding towards the door. "Adrian, wait," she pleaded. "I didn't comprehend his intentions. I swear to you, if I had known he was going to—" I departed before hearing anything further. I entered my car and drove, without a destination, only the urgent need to escape that house, the sound of my wife's voice, and the crushing realization that the woman I had spent 2 decades with had unwittingly exposed my children's whereabouts to their murderer. As I navigated the city streets, a singular thought consumed me. Oliver Hartley had executed his plan with chilling precision. He had ensnared my wife, extracted the crucial information, and then neutralized the leverage he held over me. He had orchestrated the deaths of my sons to inflict pain upon me, and now I would find him and ensure he comprehended the magnitude of his actions. Oliver Hartley's office occupied a gleaming glass skyscraper downtown, nestled 42 stories above the city, the kind of place where fortunes silently exchanged hands and decisions impacting thousands were made. I effortlessly located him in the corporate database, CEO of Hartley Development Group, a real estate mogul, philanthropist, and board member of 3 charitable organizations. On the surface, he was impeccable, legitimate, and unreachable. But I was no longer observing surfaces. I watched from my car across the street as people entered and exited the building. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Oliver emerged, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored suit, a leather briefcase in hand. He was tall, perhaps in his mid-40s, exuding the kind of assurance that stems from perpetual triumph. Dark hair, sharp features, the visage of someone accustomed to receiving everything and expecting nothing less. He bore no resemblance to a man who would order the murder of teenagers. That's when a critical understanding dawned on me. He likely didn't perceive it in that manner. To an individual like Oliver, my sons would not have been children. They would have been targets, leverage, instruments to an end, mere pawns on a chessboard, manipulated to achieve his objective. I followed him to an exclusive restaurant, the kind where waiters wore pristine white gloves and the wine list rivaled a literary novel. He was meeting a woman who appeared anxious, ceaselessly checking her phone, scanning the room. It took me a moment to recognize her, Fiona's sister, Morgan. Their conversation lasted 40 minutes. I couldn't discern their words, but I observed their nonverbal cues. Oliver dominated the discussion, while Morgan listened, nodded, and occasionally shook her head. At one point, he reached across the table and clasped her hand, reassurance or a subtle threat. It was difficult to ascertain. That night, I began to retrieve records. Hartley Development Group had been involved in scores of projects throughout the city. I delved into property deeds, business licenses, and permits. Then I began to investigate his personal history, educational records, social media, news archives. Slowly, a coherent picture started to materialize. Oliver Hartley had been raised in poverty. His mother, a single parent, held 2 jobs, never possessing significant wealth. He had ascended through scholarships and sheer determination, forging himself into a success. However, somewhere along that journey, something had become warped. Between his struggles and triumphs, he developed an insatiable hunger that money alone could not satisfy. I uncovered the crucial connection on the 4th day of my investigation. My father's name was Julian. He had passed away 15 years ago. I had attended his funeral, buried him, and continued with my life. Yet, Julian had lived a complex life before marrying my mother and before my birth. He had a brief relationship with another woman, a fleeting affair that resulted in a pregnancy. He had abandoned her. In the county records, I discovered a birth certificate. The child's name was Oliver, born to a woman named Victoria Hartley. The same surname, the same age my half-brother would have been. Oliver Hartley was my brother. More precisely, my half-brother, the son my father had forsaken. The child who grew up in penury while I enjoyed a life of comfort. The boy who witnessed his mother's struggles while I attended prestigious schools was afforded opportunities and inherited everything of value. My hands went numb with the realization. On his deathbed, my father had uttered something I had strived to forget. He spoke of regrets, of a child somewhere he had never treated fairly. I had told him it was too late to rectify it, to find peace, and he did. He bequeathed everything to me, his entire estate, the house, the investments, the money, every last thing. Oliver Hartley had watched his mother endure poverty. Then he discovered his true parentage. Then he learned that his father had left his entire legacy to the other son, to me. He had spent the last 15 years meticulously building his own success. But success was insufficient because I possessed something he could never claim: the acknowledgement of Julian's affection through his will. I had legitimacy. I had the inheritance that validated my significance. So Oliver had resolved to seize something from me that held equal importance: my children. I understood then that this was not about money, business, or even justice. This was about pain, calculated, deliberate, devastating pain. This was about a man who had spent his entire life on the periphery, observing me live the existence he believed he deserved. And when he finally discovered who I was, when he finally comprehended the connection, he concluded that causing me suffering was more valuable than anything else. He had seductively manipulated my wife to obtain information. He had hired Hunter Vex to pull the trigger. He had meticulously orchestrated the entire scheme with the precision of a man who had contemplated it for years. And the most chilling aspect was that he probably deemed it justified. He likely slept soundly, convinced he had brought cosmic equilibrium. That conviction would ultimately be his downfall. I made a solemn decision that night. I would not approach the police with mere theories and suspicions. I would acquire irrefutable, concrete proof, and then I would employ my dormant skills, the ones I had spent 2 decades attempting to shed, to guarantee that Oliver Hartley paid for his transgressions. But first, I needed to ascertain the full extent of this operation. I needed to determine if anyone else was involved. I needed to understand if my wife was merely a pawn or something more significant. And I needed to know if Oliver had intended to cease with my sons, or if more agony was yet to come. 3 days later, I confronted Fiona. She sat in the living room, staring blankly, as she had been for weeks, when I revealed everything I had uncovered. About Oliver being my half-brother, about my father's will, about the 15-year obsession that had culminated in the deaths of my sons. She offered no denial. She simply looked at me with vacant eyes and murmured, "I was oblivious to all of that." "But you recognized that something was amiss," I pressed. She nodded slowly. "After the shooting, Oliver changed. He ceased being gentle. He became enraged. He kept uttering phrases like, 'It's done now,' and 'He'll finally comprehend what it feels like.' I asked him what he meant, and he instructed me to stop asking questions. He said, 'The less I knew, the safer I'd be.' That's when the stark realization hit me. My wife had been exploited and then abandoned. Oliver had charmed her, extracted what he needed, and once his objective was fulfilled, he cast her aside as if she were inconsequential. She had transformed from a valuable asset into a liability, someone who knew too much and possessed the potential to link him to the crime. "He wants to see you," Fiona stated quietly. "He called yesterday when you were out. He expressed a desire to meet you. He stated it was time you comprehended the genesis of these occurrences. Did you convey that I would deliver his message?" "No, but he sensed I would. He mentioned that when you were prepared to listen, you would locate him." That evening, an email arrived from an unidentifiable address. It contained details for a rendezvous, an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district scheduled for midnight. Just Oliver and me. Evidently, it was a snare. His intention was either to conclude what he had initiated or to relish my despair. In any case, proceeding was sheer madness. However, I had ceased to be the individual who chose safety. For 2 decades, I had endeavored to obliterate my former self, but my sons were deceased. Security was no longer an option. I made preparations. A knife was secured to my ankle and a gun to my ribs. Arrangements were made for Fiona to stay at her sister's residence. I entrusted a sealed letter to Detective Chun to be opened only if something befell me. Then, at 11:30, I drove to the warehouse. The structure was immense and desolate, composed entirely of concrete and shadows. My footsteps reverberated as I entered. Oliver awaited at the center of the main floor, illuminated by a single overhead light, as if on a stage. He was not alone. 2 men accompanied him, burly figures clearly accustomed to violence. "Adrian," Oliver greeted, and hearing my name from his lips felt like an intrusion. I wondered when you would discern the truth. "You murdered my children," I stated, not as a question, but as an undeniable fact. "I balanced the scales," Oliver retorted. He approached, his face contorted with what appeared to be satisfaction. "Do you comprehend what it's like to mature knowing your father favored another son over you, knowing he bequeathed everything to someone else, an individual he barely knew? You could have approached me. We could have engaged in dialogue." "Dialogue?" Oliver scoffed, his laugh acrid. "Regarding what? An apology? A portion of the inheritance? No. What you possessed was something irreducible and non-negotiable. You had his affection, his affirmation, his legacy. Therefore, I seized yours." It was then I grasped the full extent of his depravity. He did not perceive this as vengeance, but as rectitude. He'd convinced himself that the slaying of my children was the sole means to restore equilibrium. "Where is the substantiation?" I inquired. "Where is your proof connecting you to Hunter Vex?" Oliver smiled. "There is none. That is the exquisite part. Your wife assisted me, yet she lacks concrete knowledge. Hunter Vex will not bear witness. He is loyal. Moreover, I am financing his defense, and you possess no evidence linking me to any of this. None. It is your assertion against nothing." He spoke truthfully. That was the essence of the trap. He'd been meticulous, exceedingly so. There was no trace leading back to him. My wife could attest to providing him with information, but that constituted no crime. Soliciting information about someone's schedule was not illegal. Without proof of his payment to Hunter Vex, without something tangible and irrefutable, I had nothing. For a moment, I considered ending his life, then and there. I was capable. I possessed the requisite skills and means, but I also understood something Oliver did not. I was no longer that individual. I was not the man who resolved difficulties through aggression. That facet of me had perished with my sons. "You will spend the remainder of your life comprehending what you have done," I stated softly. "That will be a more severe punishment than anything I could inflict upon you." Oliver's smile vanished. "That is where you err. I will spend the rest of my life knowing I triumphed, knowing I devastated you, knowing there is nothing you can do about it." But he was mistaken as well, for he failed to realize that my former proficiencies had not simply dissipated, they had evolved. And I had gleaned a crucial lesson during 2 decades of striving for normalcy. The most potent retribution is not violent. It is systematic. It is legal. It is irrefutable. I turned and exited the warehouse. Oliver's laughter followed me, believing he had emerged victorious. He had no inkling of what approached. I engaged a private investigator named Thomas Keller, whose recommendation came from Detective Chun. Chun had begun to suspect Oliver's involvement, but lacked sufficient evidence to proceed. Keller was costly, exhaustive, and crucially, he operated within the ambiguous territories inaccessible to official law enforcement. "I require everything," I instructed him during our initial consultation. "Bank records, phone records, communications, business transactions, personal relationships. I need to know every action Oliver Hartley has undertaken in the past year." Keller nodded, devoid of judgment. He had witnessed worse. "It will demand time and expense." "Money is not the concern," I responded. Over the subsequent 3 weeks, Keller's investigation delved deeper than I could have achieved independently. He uncovered the wire transfers, minor sums distributed across multiple accounts disguised as legitimate business expenditures. $50,000 had been transferred to a shell company with no apparent purpose. From there, the funds had been dispersed to various individuals, including Hunter Vex's cousin, who managed a car rental service, the same cousin who had rented the vehicle utilized in the shooting. It formed a chain, imperfect, yet discernible to someone with the acumen to scrutinize it. Keller also unearthed another revelation. Oliver had been concocting this scheme for longer than I had initially surmised. He had been investigating my family for 3 years. He had hired individuals to trail me, to photograph my children, to meticulously map their routines.
He had been patient. He had been methodical. He had been awaiting the opportune moment. And he documented all of it, not in a manner that would directly implicate him, but in a way that evinced an obsession. Photographs of my sons, my work schedule, Fiona's movements. The meticulous record of a man consumed by animosity. I also discovered a critical misstep Oliver had made. He had maintained a personal journal on his encrypted laptop. Keller managed to retrieve fragments of it, passages where Oliver had articulated his plans, his father's perceived betrayal, and how balancing the scales would finally render him whole. It would be inadmissible in court, but its power was undeniable. It demonstrated intent. It revealed motivation. It illuminated the psyche of an individual convinced of the justification for murder.
Armed with this information, I revisited Detective Chun. I presented all of Keller's findings. Chun listened intently, taking notes and posing questions. Upon my conclusion, he leaned back and rubbed his face. "This is circumstantial," he remarked. "A skilled attorney will dismantle it.
The journal fragments are inadmissible without the complete device, and we require a warrant to seize it." He continued. "The wire transfers could be legitimate business expenses. The photographs could be coincidental." "What about my wife's testimony?" I inquired. "She can attest that she furnished him with information about your family, but she was unaware of his intended use for that information. It is insufficient to charge him with conspiracy or murder." Frustration surged within me. Oliver had been excessively cautious. He had established a buffer between himself and the actual execution. He had employed intermediaries. He had erased his tracks. On paper, reasonable doubt riddled every aspect. But I also grasped another truth. I did not need to prove Oliver's guilt in a court of law. I needed to prove it in a manner that would utterly demolish him regardless. I commenced an investigation into his business. Hartley Development Group had dozens of active projects. I engaged forensic accountants to scrutinize his financial records. Their discoveries were intriguing. Several of his significant projects had been constructed on properties acquired under dubious circumstances. There were zoning violations, irregularly issued permits, and environmental reports that appeared to have been altered. This was the prevalent corruption within the construction industry. Individuals cutting corners, bribing inspectors, disregarding regulations. But when aggregated and presented to the appropriate authorities, it formed a pattern. It became fraud. It became something federal agencies would be exceedingly keen to investigate. I contacted an acquaintance from my previous life, someone working in financial crimes. I provided him with all the information. I recounted everything I had unearthed. I requested no favors. I simply laid it out and allowed him to make his own determination. 3 days later, the FBI initiated an investigation into Hartley Development Group. Oliver was blindsided. Agents appeared at his office. They seized his computers, files, and financial records. They interrogated his employees. They froze several of his bank accounts pending investigation. He was confronted with federal charges for fraud and money laundering. Nothing directly related to my sons, nothing that would prove he had ordered their deaths, but something that would irrevocably shatter his life nonetheless. From a distance, I observed the disintegration of his empire. His stock prices plummeted. His investors withdrew. Business partners distanced themselves. The man who had been untouchable suddenly faced decades in prison for white-collar crimes. And he understood why. He knew I had orchestrated this. He knew I had discovered a way to harm him despite the legal system's inability to touch him for ordering murders. One evening, approximately a month into the federal investigation, I received a call. It was Oliver. "You are shrewd," he said, his voice now altered, desperate, frightened. "But you cannot prove anything concerning your sons." "I do not have to," I responded. "You are going to prison regardless."
"You will lose everything. Your business, your freedom, your future, and everyone will know the reason why." "I did not kill them," Oliver insisted, a faint whimper in his voice now. His confidence evaporated. "I paid someone to do it. That is different." "Not to the people you injured, not to my wife, not to the families of those boys at school who witnessed the events, and not to me." "What do you desire?" he pleaded desperately. "I possess money. I terminated the call. That night, I visited my sons' graves for the first time since the funeral. I sat there in the darkness and imparted to them the unfolding events. I conveyed to them that the individual responsible for ordering their demise would suffer, not through violent acts or dreams of vengeance, but through the methodical, slow obliteration of everything he held dear. I expressed my deep regret for failing to safeguard them, and I pledged to them that their deaths would hold profound significance, ensuring Oliver Hartley fully comprehended the gravity of his actions. It wasn't about upholding justice, but it was a crucial step. The federal case against Oliver was progressively developing, yet its pace was notably slow. Investigations demand considerable time, evidence requires meticulous documentation, and witnesses must undergo multiple interviews. Meanwhile, Oliver, employing the vast resources at his disposal, secured the services of preeminent defense attorneys who proved highly proficient. They relentlessly filed motions to suppress evidence, challenged the confiscation of his digital devices, and sought to indefinitely postpone judicial proceedings. Nevertheless, an unforeseen event transpired during the third week of the investigation. Hunter Vex, incarcerated and awaiting trial, opted to break his silence. Detective Chun personally contacted me to relay this development, stating that Hunter desired to negotiate a settlement. He expressed willingness to collaborate with the prosecution. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he offered to testify that Oliver Hartley had compensated him with $50,000 to assassinate my sons. He possessed text messages corroborating this scheme, along with bank records confirming the financial transfer. He had amassed unequivocal proof.
"Why would he do that?"
I inquired of Chun.
"Pressure," Chun responded. "His family is struggling in his absence. His legal expenditures are immense. Oliver's high-priced lawyers were attempting to coax him into maintaining loyalty, but Oliver had ceased funding Hunter's defense. He had abandoned him." Hunter recognized he would face repercussions in isolation while Oliver prospered unscathed, and he deemed this inequitable. Oliver had committed his second grave misjudgment. He had mistakenly presumed that loyalty could be perpetually bought. He failed to grasp that monetary influence endures only as long as payments continue. The instant they cease, the individuals who were acquired turn against you. With Hunter's testimony, all the disparate elements coalesced. The prosecution now possessed a direct link connecting Oliver to the homicides. They had concrete evidence of payment, a compelling motive rooted in the inheritance, the familial bond, and a 15-year obsession. They had every crucial piece of information. Yet before they could proceed, another incident unfolded. Oliver's mental state had been progressively deteriorating. The immense strain of the investigation, the disintegration of his corporate empire, and the stark realization of impending imprisonment were consuming him entirely. His legal team endeavored to have him declared mentally incompetent to stand trial, asserting that he was experiencing a psychotic break triggered by extreme stress. Then, one morning, Oliver voluntarily admitted himself into a psychiatric facility. He confided in the medical staff about experiencing suicidal ideations. He articulated his inability to cope with his current circumstances. He pleaded for assistance. but his actual objective was to gain time. Mental health holds could extend for weeks or even months. This would postpone his trial, potentially affording his lawyers an opportunity to devise an insanity defense. It was a calculated maneuver, characteristic of Oliver's every action. I was aware of this because I had been ceaselessly researching him. I had deciphered the workings of his mind and understood his behavioral patterns, and I had arrived at a critical realization. Oliver needed to confess. He needed to articulate his deeds to someone. Not out of remorse, he felt none, but because he needed to offer an explanation. He required someone to comprehend the perceived justification for his actions. Therefore, I undertook an unprecedented step. I went to the psychiatric hospital where Oliver was admitted and requested a visit. The doctors attempted to prevent me, claiming he was not receiving visitors, but I asserted my family connection and remained persistent. Eventually, they acquiesced, likely assuming that a familial visit might positively impact his mental state. Oliver was in a private room when I entered. He appeared utterly ravaged. His opulent suit was replaced by hospital scrubs. His hair was disheveled, his hands trembled. Yet his eyes retained that calculating quality, that perception of someone consistently thinking multiple steps ahead. "Adrian," he uttered, and there was an almost perceptible relief in his tone. "I wasn't certain you would come." "I wanted to see you," I stated. I settled into the chair positioned opposite his bed. "They're going to charge me with murder," Oliver declared, his voice hollow. "They have that fool Hunter talking. They have evidence. My lawyers say I'm facing life in prison." I remained silent, simply waiting. "It was meant to be perfect," Oliver continued. "It was supposed to inflict pain upon you the way I've been hurt my entire life. It was supposed to balance things, and it did. For a moment, it did. But then everything unraveled. You came after me. You demolished my business. You destroyed everything I built." "You destroyed it yourself," I stated calmly. "I merely revealed your actions to others." Oliver regarded me with what might have been a flicker of respect. "You are a more astute strategist than I had credited you for. You stripped everything from me without firing a single shot. You made me comprehend what it feels like to lose everything." "Is that what you wished for me to understand?" I inquired. "What it feels like to lose everything?" "Yes," Oliver whispered. "I wanted you to experience what I felt." "I feel it every single day," I responded. "I awaken, and my children are still deceased. No amount of destroying you alters that." Oliver's face crumpled. For a fleeting moment, his facade fractured, and I glimpsed the damaged child beneath. The boy whose father had deserted him, who had spent his life striving to prove his worthiness of affection, who had finally broken and decided that if love was unattainable, at least fear could be his. "I'm sorry," he uttered, and I believed his sincerity. Not for orchestrating the deaths of my children. I don't believe he was capable of genuine remorse for that act. But sorry that his scheme had backfired. Sorry that he had underestimated me. Sorry that he was destined for prison. "Tell the prosecutor everything," I instructed. I rose to depart. "Tell him about the meticulous planning. Tell him about the financial arrangements. Tell him your motivations. Tell him absolutely everything." "Will that aid you?" Oliver asked. "No," I replied. "Nothing will ever help me. My sons remain gone. But perhaps it will assist the next family. Perhaps it will help someone else comprehend that revenge does not operate as we perceive it." I exited that room and never encountered Oliver Hartley again. However, 2 days subsequent, his lawyers announced his intention to plead guilty to 2 counts of murder for hire. He would cooperate fully with the prosecution, testifying against himself in exchange for a life sentence without parole rather than the death penalty. He opted for life imprisonment, perceiving death as an act of mercy. I then understood that Oliver, in a perversely twisted manner, had ultimately achieved his objective. He had sought to inflict pain upon me, and in hurting me, he had inflicted far greater harm upon himself. That was the authentic revenge. Not my actions against him, but his self-inflicted wounds forged by choosing a path of destruction. The trial encompassed a period of 6 weeks. It unfolded in federal court, presided over by Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 60s renowned for her impartiality yet unyielding stance against manipulation. The media provided extensive coverage. My family's tragic ordeal became a prominent headline. My sons' visages were broadcast nightly. Our private sorrow transformed into a public spectacle. The prosecution's case was meticulously constructed and utterly devastating. They meticulously charted Oliver's obsession with my family as if it were a detailed map, presenting every photograph he had taken, every note he had scrawled, every moment he had dedicated to planning. They introduced financial records, wire transfers, shell corporations, and the payments made to Hunter Vex. Forensic accountants were brought in to elucidate the intricate movement of money through the system, leaving traces that appeared invisible until one knew precisely where to search. Hunter Vex provided his testimony on the 3rd day of the trial. He sat in the witness box and recounted the unvarnished truth. He stated that Oliver had approached him with a photograph of my 2 sons and a straightforward proposition: kill them, receive $50,000, and vanish. He asserted that Oliver had provided the exact location where they would be, the precise time, and every minute detail. He claimed Oliver had described it as a personal matter, a family dispute, and that no one would connect the shooting to him. When the defense attorney cross-examined Hunter, he attempted to discredit his reliability. He highlighted Hunter's history as a career criminal, arguing that he possessed every motive to fabricate testimony to secure a reduced sentence. Yet Hunter remained steadfast. He did not embellish, nor did he endeavor to present himself in a more favorable light. He simply conveyed the truth in a flat, dispassionate tone. Then Fiona testified. She was visibly terrified. Her hands shook as she raised them to swear the oath. But she too spoke the truth. She described how Oliver had ensnared her, how he had promised her an escape from our marriage, and how he had gradually extracted information regarding our family's routines. She broke down when she recounted the profound realization of her actions, understanding that her susceptibility had contributed to the deaths of our children. The defense attempted to portray her as a conniving gold digger who had been manipulated, someone whose testimony could not be trusted because she had reason to assign blame to Oliver for the choices she had made. However, the jury did not perceive it in this manner. They saw a woman utterly shattered by guilt, truthfully acknowledging her own complicity. Subsequently, Detective Chin testified about the investigation. He systematically presented the evidence, demonstrating how each piece interconnected. He discussed the financial analysis, the phone records, and the surveillance footage. He explained how they had tracked Oliver's movements on the day of the shooting. Oliver had been nowhere near the school, yet his phone had pinged near the hotel where Hunter Vex was awaiting pickup after the execution. But the most impactful moment arrived when the prosecution presented a video deposition from Oliver himself. He sat in a room with his lawyers, appearing haggard and broken, and answered questions regarding his motivations for committing the acts.
He had something that should have been mine.
My father left him everything, Oliver lamented on the video, his voice resonating with emptiness. He grew up with everything, and I with nothing, yet he never truly valued it. He didn't even comprehend the extent of what he possessed. The prosecutor interjected, "So your decision was to abduct his children?" A prolonged silence followed before Oliver finally spoke. I desired for him to grasp the feeling of loss, to experience the agony of having everything torn away. And did it succeed? The prosecutor probed further. "No," Oliver whispered. "It only exacerbated things for both of us." The video concluded, leaving the courtroom enveloped in a profound silence. Judge Morrison maintained an unyielding expression, while the jury fixed their gaze forward, absorbing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. A confession, a motive, and a man's utter self-destruction through his own choices. The defense's argument proved tenuous, attempting to posit Oliver's mental instability, claiming a psychotic break rendered him unaccountable for his actions. They presented psychiatrists who detailed his childhood trauma, abandonment issues, and untreated mental health conditions, painting a picture of a fractured individual who buckled under pressure. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Oliver had meticulously orchestrated his plan over several years, displaying methodical and strategic precision.
He had expertly concealed his tracks, utilized intermediaries, and procured professional assistance for the execution. These were not the behaviors of someone in a psychotic state. Rather, they were the calculated actions of an individual who understood his undertakings perfectly and deliberately chose to proceed. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict on all counts. Guilty of 2 counts of murder for hire, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, and guilty of fraud related to his business dealings. Guilty on every charge. Judge Morrison pronounced the sentence of life without the possibility of parole, addressing Oliver directly with words I will never forget. "You had a choice," she stated. "You had opportunities. You built a successful business. You could have lived a good life. But instead, you chose vengeance. You chose to destroy the lives of innocent children to satisfy your own rage. You will spend the rest of your life in prison. And that is exactly what justice demands." Oliver remained inert, accepting his fate as if he had already reconciled with it within his fractured psyche. Yet, what none in that courtroom fully grasped, and what I, observing from the gallery, understood, was that Oliver had, in a twisted sense, achieved his goal. He had sought to inflict pain upon me, and he had succeeded. My sons remained deceased. No verdict, no conviction, no measure of justice could reverse this grim reality. He had irrevocably altered my life, and no punishment could undo that damage. As the marshals escorted him away, Oliver's gaze met mine. For a brief moment, our eyes connected, and I perceived something in his expression, not remorse nor satisfaction, but a peculiar serenity. He had, at last, gained the recognition he had craved his entire existence. He had, ultimately, compelled me to acknowledge him. He had finally mattered, even if only as a symbol of malevolence. I departed the courthouse without a backward glance. The media swarmed, clamoring for answers about my feelings, the sufficiency of justice, and my future plans. I offered no reply, simply walking to my car and driving home to Fiona, who awaited me, equally devastated, and in the painful process of healing. That night, we sat in shared silence, comprehending that the trial's conclusion was not an end to anything, but merely a milestone. It was a moment in time when the legal system declared guilty and believed it held significant meaning. But my sons were still gone, and I was still learning to navigate a world where their absence was permanent. 6 months after Oliver's sentencing, I found myself for the first time in a therapist's office. Dr. Eliza Morgan, a specialist in trauma and grief, didn't prompt me to articulate my emotions, weep, or therapeutically process my feelings. She simply listened as I recounted the events. Then she posed a straightforward question. "What do you envision for your life now?" I had no answer. So consumed had I been with Oliver, with justice, and with ensuring he suffered consequences for his actions, that I hadn't contemplated what might come next. I hadn't even considered that there could be a subsequent chapter. "I don't know," I confessed. My sons are dead. My wife is broken. I am a man who should be retired, living a tranquil life. Instead, I am someone who knows how to hunt people down and destroy them. That isn't a life. It's mere existence. Dr. Morgan nodded thoughtfully. Those are indeed 2 distinct concepts, and I believe you already grasp the difference. The question is whether you are willing to choose existence or life. In the weeks that followed, I began the arduous process of rebuilding. It was neither dramatic nor swift.
It was slow, painful, and often felt futile, yet I persisted.
I resumed work, though my job now felt hollow. The office where I had spent 2 decades seemed diminished, less significant. Having witnessed genuine evil firsthand, corporate spreadsheets and quarterly reports no longer held any importance. I tendered my resignation, opting for early retirement. My boss attempted to persuade me to remain, but I couldn't. I needed room to breathe. Fiona and I also pursued therapy together. Our marriage had fractured long before Oliver's intrusion into our lives. His affair had merely exposed existing fissures. We didn't seek therapy with expectations of miraculous fixes. We went because we shared 2 decades of history and desired to understand what had gone awry and whether anything could be salvaged. The truth was intricate. Fiona had felt neglected, and I had been emotionally distant, preoccupied with my past. She had experienced loneliness even while we cohabited. Oliver had offered her attention and the allure of escape. She was vulnerable, and he exploited that vulnerability. This wasn't an excuse for her divulging information about her children, but it provided context, a reason. It wasn't simply a matter of betrayal. It was the culmination of 2 individuals who had ceased to truly know each other. "I don't know if we can recover from this," Fiona articulated during one session as we sat on opposite ends of a couch, physically apart. "I don't know either," I admitted. "But I want to try. Not because I believe things will revert to how they were, they won't, but because abandoning 20 years feels like allowing Oliver to triumph all over again." We progressed slowly, initiating genuine conversations instead of merely coexisting in the same space. We began to recall the initial reasons for our marriage. It was arduous and awkward, yet undeniably real. 3 months into therapy, Fiona asked me to speak about my past, not the intricate details of my black ops career, but to understand who I was before our meeting, what had shaped me, and why I had been so remote. So I shared my story. I spoke of growing up with an emotionally absent father and choosing a life of service and peril because it seemed the only path to significance. I recounted how I had spent 2 decades attempting to suppress that version of myself, yet it had never truly vanished, always lurking. When the boys were shot, I explained, that buried part of me resurfaced, and I became someone I thought I had left behind, someone dangerous, someone capable of tracking a man and obliterating his entire existence. And I did it without hesitation because my grief provided permission. Fiona listened intently, without interruption. When I concluded, she remarked, "But you didn't kill him. You didn't become a murderer like he was. You utilized the system. You used evidence and the law."
"That's not the same as what he did."
"Isn't it?" I questioned. "I destroyed his life as thoroughly as if I had pulled the trigger. I took everything from him."
"He took everything from us first," Fiona gently countered. "He took our children. He took our peace. He took our future. What you did was prevent him from taking anything more." I pondered her words for a long time. Meanwhile, I found myself spending time at Marcus and Kyle's graves. I had avoided them after the trial, but eventually returned. I sat there, speaking to them. I wasn't certain if they could hear me. Indeed, I wasn't sure what I believed, but I needed to speak to someone, and they felt like the right people. I recounted Oliver's trial, his sentence, and the fact that the man responsible for their deaths would spend his life in prison. I apologized for not having protected them better. I told them I loved them and would devote the rest of my life to ensuring they were remembered. On the first anniversary of their deaths, I established a scholarship fund in their names for students who had experienced loss and trauma and who aspired to careers in social work, counseling, or victim advocacy. I funded it generously, ensuring their names were prominently displayed. I made sure people knew who Marcus and Kyle had been and what they deserved. A local news station covered the scholarship, interviewing me, and for the first time, I spoke publicly about my sons. I spoke of Marcus's dream of becoming a pilot, Kyle's passion for music, their kindness, and their humor. I spoke of them as individuals, not as victims. The story went viral.
People began reaching out, parents who had lost children to violence, individuals who understood grief in all its horrific manifestations. They shared their stories with me, and through their sharing, I realized I was not alone in my sorrow. Thousands carried this burden, millions worldwide whose lives had been shattered by violence and rage. I began volunteering with an organization supporting families of murder victims and became an advocate for criminal justice reform. Utilizing my personal journey, resources, and hard-won insights into the complex system, I dedicated myself to assisting others impacted by violence. One day, Detective Chun, having retired from the police force, contacted me. He shared that working on my case profoundly altered his professional perspective, making him recognize the systemic failings in offering victims meaning or healing. He understood that the system was primarily designed to penalize offenders, yet punishment offered no solace or reprieve from grief. He confessed, "I'm contemplating embarking on a path similar to yours. I wish to engage with families, helping them comprehend their choices and find a measure of tranquility." I wholeheartedly supported his aspiration. Subsequently, we began meeting for coffee periodically, discussing cases, dissecting the intricacies of the system, and grappling with the profound burden of knowing too much about human cruelty. Approximately a year and a half after Oliver's sentencing, I received a letter from the federal prison where he was incarcerated. My initial impulse was to discard it unread, but an inexplicable urge compelled me to open it. Oliver had penned a letter. He described his existence within the prison walls, a fate I felt he justly deserved. He recounted having ample time to reflect on his actions, acknowledging the futility of his scheme. He detailed how other inmates recognized him, aware of his high-profile case and his unfortunate transformation into a cautionary figure. He spoke of the daily torment of living with the knowledge of the devastation he had wrought. Yet, more significantly, he expressed his struggle to comprehend why his father had chosen me over him. He wrote, "Years of contemplation have led me to believe that your father perceived hope in you. He saw someone capable of transcending their circumstances. I believe that is precisely what I sought when I attacked you, proof that I too was worthy of such hope. However, I chose a trajectory that ultimately disproved this. I demonstrated that regardless of my achievements or creations, I was capable of annihilating everything in pursuit of revenge." The letter concluded with an apology, not a self-serving attempt at manipulation or eliciting forgiveness, but a sincere acknowledgement of his deeds and the ensuing destruction. He stated he was not seeking absolution, merely desiring that I understand his realization. I reread that letter 5 times before setting it aside. I did not share it with anyone, nor did I consider replying. Yet I could not bring myself to discard it, for the truth was, I had long ago forgiven Oliver. This forgiveness was not an absolution of his crimes, but rather a release from the consuming rage. My sons remained gone, and Oliver remained imprisoned. Forgiveness altered neither of these facts. However, it profoundly changed me, allowing me to disengage from being defined by what he had stolen, and instead focus on what I was actively creating in its stead. 2 years after the sentencing, Fiona and I renewed our vows. This was a private ceremony, attended only by our immediate family and a select group of friends. It wasn't because our lives were suddenly perfect or because we had resolved every issue. We renewed them because we had deliberately chosen each other once more, consciously and intentionally, having navigated immense darkness and deciding that we still wished to confront the future together. I transitioned from part-time advocacy work to launching my own nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families affected by violent crime, with Fiona joining me as co-director. Our days often stretched to 12 hours, sometimes spent guiding people through systems that seemed designed to amplify their suffering. Nevertheless, our efforts made a tangible difference in subtle ways. With every family we assisted, we were actively transforming our personal tragedy into a meaningful purpose. On the 2nd anniversary of my sons' deaths, as I stood by their graves with Fiona, a profound realization dawned on me. Something had shifted. The grief was still present and always would be, but its nature had evolved. It was no longer the all-consuming grief that annihilated everything it touched.
Instead, it had become a grief that motivated, that impelled towards meaning, transforming pain into proactive engagement.
"Do you think they would be proud of us?" Fiona whispered softly. "I believe they would want us to be happy," I responded. "I think they would want us to endure this and discover a compelling reason to persevere. And I believe they would want their deaths to hold significance." As the sun set, we remained there, and I grasped what true revenge encompassed. Not destruction and despair, but rather illumination and healing. It involved not inflicting harm upon the person who had wronged us, but extending aid to those who would inevitably follow, burdened by their own unbearable sorrows. Oliver Hartley had attempted to obliterate me by snatching everything I cherished. Ultimately, however, he had only unveiled my authentic capabilities, which were not violence and vengeance, but resilience and profound transformation. My sons were gone, a permanent void.
Yet their legacy was blossoming into something beautiful, something that would benefit others long after Oliver and I were gone and forgotten. That, I understood, was the true triumph. 5 years had passed since Oliver Hartley entered federal prison. 5 years since the trial concluded, 5 years since I stood in that courtroom witnessing a form of justice that failed to satisfy anyone. On a Tuesday morning, I was in my office reviewing case files for the families we were currently supporting. The nonprofit had expanded far beyond Fiona's and my initial expectations. We now employed a staff of 12, operated offices in 3 different cities, and were assisting hundreds of families in navigating the aftermath of violent crime. It was undeniably exhausting work, yet it was the only work that felt truly authentic to me anymore. My phone vibrated, a text from Fiona. "Don't forget the 5-year remembrance ceremony at the park today."
2 o'clock. I had forgotten, or perhaps I had unconsciously avoided thinking about it. Every year, on the anniversary of Marcus and Kyle's deaths, we organized a small gathering at the park near their school. We would invite families who had also lost children to violence, plant flowers, share stories, and, most importantly, remind ourselves and each other that these lives had mattered, that they were real, and that they would never be forgotten. I closed my laptop and departed. Upon my arrival, the ceremony was already underway. Approximately 40 individuals had gathered, parents, siblings, grandparents, all visibly carrying the profound weight of loss. Fiona was conversing with a woman whose daughter had been killed in a road rage incident 3 years prior. When Fiona noticed me, she squeezed my hand. Both of us had changed significantly over those 5 years. The raw, searing grief had softened into something more manageable. We smiled more frequently, and sometimes we even laughed. Yet there were still mornings when I woke up and, for a fleeting moment, forgot that my sons were dead. Then reality would brutally crash back, and I would have to endure that realization all over again. A woman approached me. She was younger, perhaps in her early 30s, with red-rimmed eyes and the distinct exhaustion that accompanies recent bereavement. "Are you Adrian?" she asked quietly. "The one who founded this organization?" "I am," I confirmed. "My son was killed 8 months ago," she explained. He was 17. A random act of violence. The man who did it is still in prison, awaiting trial. I heard your story about what happened to your family, and I wanted to know how you survived it, how you managed not to destroy yourself with revenge." I paused before responding. This question, in various forms, was one I often encountered, and I had learned that there was no simple answer. "I tried to destroy myself with revenge," I admitted. "For a while, that was my sole desire. But I learned an important lesson. The person most devastated by revenge is the one who seeks it." The man who killed my sons, his brother, technically, though I didn't realize that initially, he believed that destroying my children would somehow restore balance within himself. It didn't. It only generated more destruction. And when I pursued him, I was traversing the very same path he had taken. It took me a long time to realize I had a choice.
"What choice?" she asked, her voice laced with desperation. "The choice between becoming like him or becoming someone different. Between allowing his violence to define my life or using my life to prevent others from experiencing what I endured. It's not a choice that brings my sons back. It's not a choice that eliminates the pain. But it's a choice that transforms the pain into something with meaning." She listened intently, and I observed some of the desperation beginning to recede from her face. Not the grief, which would never fully dissipate, but the urgent need for revenge. The feeling that she absolutely had to destroy something to make the pain cease. Perhaps I had granted her permission to release that overwhelming need. Later that evening, after the ceremony had concluded and people had dispersed, Fiona and I sat on a bench overlooking the park where Marcus and Kyle used to play. "I received a call today," Fiona began, "from my sister, Morgan. You remember her, don't you? The one involved with Oliver?" I nodded. Morgan had testified at the trial about how Oliver had exploited her to get closer to Fiona. She had been deeply ashamed of her role in the events, although it was evident she had also been manipulated. "She's getting married," Fiona continued. "She wanted to know if we would attend the wedding. I told her I would ask you first." "What do you wish to do?" I inquired. "I want to go," Fiona stated. "I want to show her that we've forgiven her, not because what she did was acceptable, it wasn't, but because she was also a victim, and I think she needs to see that it's possible to move forward." I nodded in agreement. 5 years ago, I would never have been capable of that. 5 years ago, I would have viewed Morgan as an accomplice, a link in the chain of events that culminated in my son's deaths. But I had come to understand that revenge and forgiveness exist on a spectrum, and sometimes the most powerful act is to extend grace to individuals who may not deserve it, but desperately need it. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived from Oliver. It was sent through the prison mail system, and I nearly did not open it. Yet something compelled me to. In the letter, Oliver informed me he had been transferred to a different prison facility. He had found employment as a counselor within the mental health unit, assisting fellow inmates in confronting their traumas and anger. He penned a letter explaining that 5 years had passed in his quest to comprehend his actions, and that he was finally grasping the profound enormity of his transgression in a manner that transcended mere legal adjudication. "I stole your children from you because I was shattered," he wrote. "I believed that if I could break you as I was broken, some equilibrium would be restored. But now I understand that inflicting pain on another does not mend oneself, it merely amplifies the damage. I will never know if you will read this, and I am not seeking your forgiveness. Yet, I want you to be aware that I am now dedicating my life to deterring other men from making the same choices I did. This will not revive your sons, nor will it undo the harm I inflicted, but it is the only path to redemption available to me." I reread the letter multiple times, and this time I reacted differently. I wrote back. I communicated to him that his journey to redemption was not my concern. I emphasized that my forgiveness was not something he had earned or was entitled to. However, I also expressed that if he was genuinely striving to help others avoid his missteps, I respected that endeavor. I conveyed that my sons would have wished for a world where fewer individuals experienced the profound loss we had endured. And if his work contributed even marginally to that goal, then some good might emerge from his darkness. I dispatched the letter before I could second-guess my decision. That evening, Fiona posed a question I had sidestepped for 5 years. "Do you have any regrets about how you handled Oliver? Do you regret dismantling his business instead of simply allowing the justice system to prosecute the murders?" I contemplated my response carefully. "I don't regret it," I eventually stated, "but I perceive it differently now. My actions constituted vigilante justice, masked by corporate fraud charges. It worked, but its success hinged on resources and knowledge that most people lack. If I had been someone else, without my background, I would have been powerless, and that is a significant problem. That is not a functional system." "So, what are you implying?" Fiona inquired.
I am saying that my narrative, our narrative, is not a blueprint for how people should process loss. It's an illustration of what transpires when an individual takes the law into their own hands, and how that person gets fortunate enough not to become a murderer themselves. I am saying that the true solution is not vigilante justice or revenge. It is a system that genuinely aids victims and their families in healing. It is accountability that does not demand self-destruction in the process. Fiona nodded. "That is why we engage in this work," she remarked, gesturing broadly towards the office, the families we served, and the legacy we were building. "Precisely," I concurred. 5 years into the future, a new chapter unfolded. A full decade had elapsed since Oliver Hartley had taken my sons' lives. A complete decade of sorrow and recovery, of transforming rage into purpose, of reconstructing a life on entirely different foundations than I had known before. Our nonprofit organization had expanded, now boasting offices in 15 cities. We had assisted over 3,000 families and successfully advocated for policy changes that had come to fruition: novel victim support programs, enhanced mental health services in prisons, and criminal justice reforms prioritizing healing over mere punishment. Fiona and I shared a different kind of relationship now. Our love persisted, yet it had deepened, having been forged in fire. It was authentic because it had endured the most unimaginable ordeal. One afternoon, while seated in a bookstore, I observed a young man engrossed in one of the memoirs chronicling my case. Several journalists had been captivated by the story: the half-brother seeking vengeance, the wife's betrayal, the intricate system of justice I had meticulously constructed. It certainly made for compelling reading. The young man noticed my gaze and, joking about celebrity egos, asked if I wanted the book back. I smiled, explaining that I didn't own it, but was curious about his impressions. "It's intense," he commented. "This guy lost his kids, and instead of spiraling, he essentially leveraged his intellect and resources to utterly dismantle the perpetrator. And the thing is, it makes sense. You understand his motivations, but it also highlights the immense power some people possess that others don't. I mean, what if he wasn't intelligent? What if he wasn't wealthy? What would have become of his children's killer then?" Exactly. I think I'm going to explore criminal justice reform work. I didn't realize it was something I could do. That moment crystallized a profound realization for me. My personal tragedy, my fury, my journey through humanity's darkest corners, it possessed the power to inspire others to engage in meaningful work. It could avert further tragedies. It could transform pain into purpose on a scale I could not have conceived 10 years prior, when I was merely a shattered father striving to endure. A final message for you. I want to pose a question. From where are you watching this story unfold? What brought you here today? And, more crucially, what narratives truly resonate with you? What stories ignite your spirit, provoke your thoughts, and inspire you to become a better version of yourself? Because stories hold immense significance. They shape our perception of the world. They define what we believe is achievable. And I firmly believe that the stories we choose to consume matter deeply. If you are watching this and have experienced loss as I have, I want you to understand that your pain does not have to dictate your life. You have a pivotal choice. You can allow it to destroy you, or you can transform it into something that benefits others. That is not a trivial distinction. It is everything. Please hit like if this story moved you. Subscribe to encounter more narratives like this, tales of betrayal, of loss, of how human beings can either unravel or heal together. Feel free to comment with your city or country below. Tell me what kinds of stories you yearn to see. Share what themes speak to your soul. Describe the narratives that make you feel less isolated in your own suffering. And keep an eye out for our upcoming story, as we have an incredible thriller on the horizon, a saga of epic revenge, of secrets that shatter families, of the extraordinary lengths individuals will go to safeguard what they hold most dear. It promises to be intense, unforgettable,
and it's coming soon. Until then, remember this truth. The most potent form of revenge is not destruction, but transformation. It is taking the worst experience that befell you and utilizing it to prevent that very same hardship from afflicting someone else. That is not a sign of weakness. It is strength in its purest manifestation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about my family's story. And thank you for being the kind of person who believes in the transformative power of stories. I will see you in the next one.